Rin is a Sea Grant Fellow in DOE's Wind Energy Technologies Office, working on the offshore wind social science portfolio. She has a BS in Oceanography from the University of Washington and is pursuing her PhD in Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology at Arizona State University, studying Arctic and subarctic ocean governance practices. She is motivated to study and work in government to improve public access and engagement with ocean decision-making. Today, she will be presenting on a two-part study on Pebble Mine, Alaska, and how public concerns about ocean impacts came to matter for decision-making on a land-based project. She'll share some of her thoughts on what this case can show us about considering ocean relations in broader environmental governance. Thank you, Rin.
Thank you for the introduction, Stephanie. I'm very excited to share my work with everyone today. Before I jump in, I wanted to share one more bit about my background and how I got to this study on impact statements. I've done some extensive work on the NEPA process, opportunities for public engagement, and how public perspectives are considered throughout the process. This was an opportunity to look at the final product of that. I also have photos of Alaska in this presentation, but sadly none of them are of Pebble Mine, as I haven't had a chance to do fieldwork at the site. Oh, should I click on there? I've broken this presentation out into 4 sections to hopefully provide useful contextualization, both to my study that I've worked on as part of my PhD and the major goals of my research. First, I'll cover some of the social context for Pebble Mine, particularly concerns about ocean impacts. I'll then share brief overviews of 2 parts of study, the first being a rhetoric analysis of Pebble Partnership's website to understand how they linked public concerns about the ocean, federal science, and the permitting process. The second is a smaller ongoing project of analyzing the 2020 final EIS from Army Corps for how ocean concerns were integrated, articulated, and addressed in this land-based decision-making tool. I'll end by connecting this project to the much larger goal of my research on identifying strategies and practices for connecting ocean relations into broader environmental governance. And I will pause here to say that I'll be using 3 terms, Pebble Mine, Pebble Partnership, and Pebble Deposit, to describe proposed activity, the company, and the site, respectively. So let me begin by providing some information on what Pebble Mine is. This is a proposed land-based mine in southwestern Alaska that sits on the largest copper and gold deposit of its type in the world. I will note that the deposit extends beyond federal management, and mine development has already begun on lands managed by the state. I should just focus on the federal engagement. And the site of the mine is over 100 air miles from Bristol Bay, the site of the majority of ocean concerns. And on first glance, this may make Pebble Mine seem like an interesting case of ocean governance, but as I'll show in a moment, the ocean mattered a lot with public concern. In particular, public concerns about potential impacts of Pebble deposit development to Bristol Bay salmon fisheries predate any formal federal review processes, as shown in these headlines. Bristol Bay houses the world's most productive salmon fishery, along with being a major site of subsistence fishing and gathering for Alaska Natives. These concerns made national headlines throughout the last decade, and fisher protests in Seattle in 2014 are what first made me aware of this project. Headlines have ranged from focusing on fisheries impacts, the economic context of resource development in Alaska and their larger economic needs, being critical of science on all sides, and as I will get into more later, the litigations of these topics against Pebble Partnership and against federal agencies. The domination of ocean concerns in public spheres pushed ocean considerations into new spaces of the onshore decision-making, especially considering the focus on Bristol Bay and not the saltwater bay that has a proposed ferry infrastructure for the mine. Almost a decade after the federal government became actively involved in Pebble Mine, the final EIS was published by Army Corps, and included comments that really encapsulate the primary points of concern. I've narrowed these to two major points. First were concerns about impacts of contaminants on subsistence resources. And while this was not exclusively an ocean concern, Alaska Native, the indigenous peoples of Alaska, their concerns about Bristol Bay and subsistence were a primary factor into EPA getting involved in conducting a watershed assessment in 2011. The second concern I include was the most prominently tied to Bristol Bay fisheries, the potential for contamination from spills and events such as retaining pond collapses. So my first foray into studying Pebble Mine was part of a larger study aiming to understand organizational rhetorics about oceans and ocean use in Alaska, where I looked at websites as stable presentations of organizations. In this larger study, I looked at some federal agency websites, some Alaska-based nonprofits, as well as extraction companies. Pebble Mine's rhetoric was particularly interesting to me within this much larger context of public ocean concern and the remote distance from saltwater. Shown here is a website map that I know is kind of hard to read, but I will zoom in just a moment on some parts of this. And this just shows the linking the website pages and showing how one can move through them if they're on Pebble Partnership's website. The front page of the website quotes the final EIS from the Army Corps of Engineers, stating that, quote, the project would provide long-term economic benefits from employment and income in the region and state. The overarching rhetoric centers the economic conversations, as well as protests relating to oceanic science, particularly EPA's watershed assessment that was completed in 2014. Pebble Partnership claims that, quote, the EPA produced Bristol Bay Watershed Assessment using faulty data and seeking a predetermined outcome. The assessment was conducted at the request of Alaska Native tribes concerned about salmon impacts, and the faulty data of the EPA assessment is presented on the website as something that will be challenged by a proper impact assessment and permitting process. In this process, Pebble states, quote, permitting experts will conduct a rigorous and scientific review demanding transparency and accountability, unquote. These concerns fit into a much larger Alaska environmental governance discussion about federal overreach that's been ongoing since predating statehood in 1950. However, they do highlight the particular importance of the ocean within these practices, as the ocean is where the federal government first got involved. And the EPA got involved even before Pebble Partnership had applied for a federal permit to begin kind of development in the NEPA process. I want to take a moment to zoom in on two of the sections of the website, one titled The Facts on the left and the other Final EIS on the right. I particularly want to draw attention to three of the pages under the left, which are circled in yellow. These are titled What About the Fish? But the Science, and What Are the Facts? These three pages focus on the aquatic, and particularly salmon fisheries concerns. And the quote from the prior slide on EPA using faulty data is framed as simply bad science, that the full permitting process is presented as a solution to the bad science that will prove lack of significant impact to these marine ecosystems. It is not presented as a process that will lead towards a predetermined outcome of lack of significant impacts. The final EIS pages are mostly descriptive, quoting and referring directly to the document. However, Stay Engaged links to an affiliated website also ran by Pebble Partnership that is titled Right Mine, Right Time, whose homepage includes multiple quotes from the final EIS about salmon and commercial fisheries, starting with, quote, impacts to Bristol Bay salmon are not expected to be measurable. These two websites run by the same company, yet they present very different rhetorics. One focused on faulty data and federal activity and overreach concerns, while the other emphasizes purely a lack of impact. Now that I've shared how Pebble Mine came to be situated in relation to the ocean and how that context was then integrated into Pebble Partnership's website, I want to turn towards the environmental governance aspects. And I'm going to start that with a timeline. I had a really hard time deciding when in this presentation to share this, so I hope it helps and is not further confusing. So in 2011, EPA began a watershed assessment of Bristol Bay's watershed at the request of Alaska Natives to assess potential impacts of pebble deposit development. This occurred before the partnership applied for federal permits or any activity on federal lands. After the assessment was completed in 2014, EPA recommended a preemptive veto of future permit requests and began Clean Water Act 404C protection processes to protect Bristol Bay. In the course of a year, Pebble Partnership instigated 3 lawsuits against the EPA related to the watershed assessment. While 2 were dismissed by the courts, the third halted EPA's efforts to protect Bristol Bay. This lawsuit was not settled until 2017, but 404C protections were left on hold by the settlement. And shortly after this decision, Pebble Partnership submitted for a federal permit, which led to Army Corps publishing a draft EIS in 2019. The same year, EPA withdrew its proposed determination related to their prior watershed announcement. The final EIS was published in summer 2020, and the Corps determined a no-go decision, which was published in August. I share this timeline because it demonstrates how, in multiple points of development of Pebble Mine, the ocean mattered to federal decision-making outcomes, starting from initial federal involvement with Bristol Bay. If I had infinite time, I would be expanding my research to compare the EPA watershed assessment document, the draft EIS, and the final EIS to examine how the ocean was articulated and mattered differently at those 3 core points of the Pebble Mine process. However, for a variety of reasons, that will not be my dissertation. Instead, I just focused on the final EIS in consideration that it is relatively rare for a land-based project to get to the point of a final document and still receive a no-go decision. I already shared how public concerns about the ocean were included in the document with public comments, so here I will highlight the way science connected the land site to the ocean. In my analysis, I focused on the sections that were most likely to include discussion of the oceans, so those that covered marine ports, fisheries, and water quality. I found that the discussion of ocean impacts was almost exclusively isolated to the geographic vicinity of the proposed ferry terminal in Kamishak Bay. This is where disruptions to benthic habitat and species distribution were presented. And this is on the opposite side of the mine from Bristol Bay. Perhaps one of the most interesting discussions connecting to the ocean was how salmon as anadromous species were described and articulated in the EIS. Albeit the public concern about how salmon may be impacted while residing within saltwater, the EIS primarily focused on how salmon would encounter mine infrastructure, waste, and disruptions during their time in saltwater, drawing a definite kind of analysis boundary at the coast. Considering the most current structures for decision-making about development and how the NEPA process is structured, it makes sense that direct impacts to saltwater were primarily focused on geographic proximity to ferry infrastructure. My goal in my broader work is to work towards challenging that model and find ways for more cohesive considerations of the ocean across environmental decision-making. I know I'm speaking to mostly a bunch of NOAA people who the ocean centers in our work a lot, but Pebble Mine demonstrates how the ocean does matter in decision-making that's not even centered on the ocean. So I ask how we can acknowledge and work with that ocean mattering in new ways to think towards more open practices that may make government more accessible to a broader public, engage cultural differences in understanding with tribes, and generate kind of decision-making outcomes that work well into the future in the face of major challenges like climate change, which will drastically impact the ocean. So if you'll all will let me be conceptual for a moment, my dissertation and ongoing research is working on articulating 3 core aspects of shifting these approaches. First is thinking a consideration of bidirectional relations, especially for land-based activities. Pebble's final EIS focused on sites where its infrastructure reached traditionally accepted ocean boundaries, the coastline. I question how approaches to decision-making might be different if these land-based activities engaged further with the ocean coming onshore, potentially as directly as consideration of tides and how those carry contaminants, or more conceptually of salmon and acknowledging and understanding their experiences in saltwater. This is closely related to my second point of thinking about power dynamics and how things matter. Now, Pebble Mine Pebble Partnership might say public concern mattered too much in the resulting no-go decision. In fact, they've rapidly made accusations of political interference because the no-go was announced shortly after the election. But those concerns and Alaska Native perspectives were integrated into the EIS process in ways that fit this predetermined structure. Concerns related to the mine, in the eyes of the public, may have been left out of consideration simply for not fitting the preconceived understanding of what mattered and could be impacted. Third, and what I believe to be potentially the hardest, is centering ocean relations in the process. Those of us who focus on the ocean know its fluidity and the difficulty in drawing stable boundaries and governing the ocean. So what lessons for managing these fluid spaces can be moved into onshore and other environmental decision-making spaces? What I just described is one of the things I'm most passionate about, thinking towards not just the ways our activity goes offshore, but the way the ocean comes in. And one of my biggest reasons for applying for the Knauss Fellowship was to build a deeper understanding of how decision-making and engagement happen within the government, so I could work towards making some more actionable potential recommendations. I don't think this slide contains new ideas, but I wonder what would happen if we were enabled to approach these interactions from a more ocean-centered approach, more even footing, and not having to set some of the ocean aside to fit into terrestrial processes. I've been excited to see interagency collaboration fostering new potential for balancing land and sea concerns this year, especially working in the offshore wind space, let alone the many places that fellowships allow to interject oceanic expertise in government. Perhaps one of the most challenging is rethinking processes like NEPA and EISs in a way that includes the ocean. However, growing conversations about the effectiveness of these processes may open up new transformative opportunities. So that's where I will leave it. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Rin. So audience, we have about 9 minutes to answer your questions. If you have questions, we welcome them, and we ask that you type them in the questions chat box, which is on the right side of your screen, and I will read them out loud to our speaker, who has also provided her slides as a handout. So if you're interested in her actual slides, please look at the handouts drop-down menu and grab the one from Rin Ball. So let's see. While you were talking, there was a compliment. Of course, I always like to read those compliments, Rin. It says, "Great talk. I like the history."
I'm glad. I never know if I'm giving too much about Alaska in these projects.
No, I think it was very appropriate. It helped bigger picture. So sometimes it takes a minute to get a question, and we'll give the audience another second before we move on to our next speaker. Oh, here we go. Here's one question. It says, "Thank you, great presentation. How much did EFH consultation play a role in the EIS?"
Okay. I am not remembering off the top of my head what EFH is.
Essential fish habitat.
Okay. I know there was a lot of EFH within the EIS focused, as I mentioned, a lot of that analysis or kind of habitat impacts was around the ferry infrastructure, not Bristol Bay. I know that there was some analysis of Bristol Bay and the fisheries, but not a very significant amount, or it at least wasn't discussed much in the EIS. Fisheries habitat analysis for Bristol Bay was left to very short sections that essentially said there was no significant impact for any of the alternatives. And again, I just looked at the document, not the process, so I can't give more elaboration on that.
That works. I'm gonna give it another second, see if we get more questions. And if not, I really appreciate you sharing your work, and I hope that, we are, as I mentioned, we're recording this today, so if any of you think that Rin's work might be interesting to a colleague, appreciate it if you would forward that webinar later on. We just got a second question. This question asks, thinking about expanding our treatment and inclusion of ocean impacts, if you had to expand this idea, would you make a geographic limit or boundary to effects?
I think to direct effects, geographic boundaries do make sense. I'm an oceanographer, so sometimes we talk in oceanography about impacts going everywhere in the world. That doesn't make sense. You can't govern it, kind of an infinite system. But I think there's a difference between including impacts and including the relationships. And I don't think there needs to be a geographic boundary on how we include ocean relationships in our decision making. Actual assessment of impacts, yes. And to me, part of that difference is things like the Inland Ocean Coalition is a really cool nonprofit that started in Colorado to get people in Colorado thinking about how their actions go downstreams and connect with the ocean, and how the ocean produces oxygen that they might be breathing. And those are really large-scale relationships that I think we could be considering irrespective of impacts. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. We did get another comment here. It says, great summary and identification of the difficulty in understanding the NEPA nexus and complex ecosystem connections at the ocean-land interface.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that that last comment will be our last comment for this part of the presentation. Thank you so much, Rin.